I want to welcome you to the Amram Scholar Series. I want to really once again give incredible thanks to Leslie Maitland, who is our Amram Scholar Chair, who I complain to Leslie. She takes away all my time because I want books that I can skim. This is an impossible book to skim. This is, I will tell you later that this is one of the best thrillers that I have read in ages, besides being in so many ways. So again, I want to thank Leslie, who has an incredible talent because she hears the speakers for 2 minutes, Leslie, and has so far has been batting, has a phenomenal batting average for our Scholar Series this year, and no one will be disappointed today. We begin our Scholar Series. I want to share just a few minutes of quick introduction. How timely is the undergirding theme of Veritas, truth? In our day and age, when we question the use of fiction to advance truth, but whose truth and for what purpose, we must ask. In an age when integrity, truth, fiction are paramount in our daily lives, having witnessed our democracy assaulted and often the media blame, what is clear, the Veritas, the truth, comes from our author, Ariel Sabar, whose journalistic integrity gives us the opportunity to see how academic scholarship, religious doctrine, and university politics all play out in a fascinating story that goes from the halls of Harvard Divinity School to the painted ceilings of the Vatican to the cradle, candlelit bungalows in Florida, doubling as a porn studio to a papyrus factory. The story of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, Fragment, is a best-selling thriller. It's one of the best thrillers I've read in years, with a fascinating true story of scandal, the highest levels of academia. Award-winning author, journalist Ariel is going to discuss today Veritas, a Harvard professor, a con man in the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. A tale of fierce intellectual rivalries is piercing psychological portrait of disillusioned college dropout whose life had reached a breaking point. It's also a tragic story about a brilliant scholar who was handed a piece of scripture that embodied her greatest hopes for Christianity. Our author, Ariel Sabar, is an award-winning journalist whose work appears in The Atlantic, The New York Times, the Harper's Magazine, the Washington Post, Smithsonian Magazine, and many other publications. He's the author of My Father's Paradise, a son's search for his Jewish past in Kurdish Iraq, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award for autobiography. He presents an incredible opportunity for us. His book, in the writing of this, he tells us that he conducted more than 450 interviews. I think I counted, he visited 12 countries and carried this all the way through in such a wonderful way. It is my honor and privilege to give you Ariel Sabar, and I want to congratulate you. And I will just tell you that we're going to put it in the side. This is a book that is both educational in so many ways, and I just want to commend you. I've taken many classes in early Christian theology. I know a lot about the academic world. I spend time at the Vatican, and I learned so much from your book, and that learning never took away from what was one of the most incredible stories that I've ever journeyed through. So we're so delighted, and we welcome you and look forward to you sharing with us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Lustig, and thank you as well to Leslie Maitland for making this happen. It's an honor to speak to the Washington Hebrew congregation. I'm thrilled that you're interested in this book. I've been on the sort of Jewish Book Council book tour before, and I was sort of wondering, would I get picked up again for a book about Jesus. I'm really glad I did, because I do think the themes of the book speak to people of any faith, and people who care about how knowledge is created, and sort of the sometimes porous line between reason and faith. So I'm really thrilled that your congregation picked this up, and I'm excited to speak to you. So I'm gonna speak for about half an hour, and then I think we're going to open it up to some questions, led first by the rabbi, and then hopefully some questions from the audience as well. So I thought I would start by reading part of the book's prologue, because it puts readers in the room at a key moment in the story, a moment that I think resonates in different ways as the rest of the book unfolds. Here goes. On September 18, 2012, a group of international scholars gathered in a building across from the Vatican for an obscure academic conference on Egypt's earliest Christians. The week-long program looked much like those of years past, with highly specialized lectures on Egyptian linguistics, monastery libraries, and the wills of abbots. But at 7 o'clock that evening, the conference lost any semblance of the ordinary. A senior Harvard University professor rose to the lectern to make an astonishing announcement, one that a select group of journalists was at that very moment transmitting across the globe. She had discovered an ancient scrap of papyrus with the power to convulse the Roman Catholic Church. The professor, a 58-year-old historian named Karen King, was a well-known and deeply respected figure in the field of biblical studies. Harvard had recently promoted her to its Hollis Professorship of Divinity, the oldest endowed chair in America and one of the most prestigious posts in the study of Christianity. She was familiar to the public, too, as a best-selling author and TV commentator on the first centuries of the faith. But the events of September 2012 would put her in a brighter and crueler spotlight than any she had known before. In a room overlooking the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, King told the audience of elite scholars that she had already given her discovery a name. Quote, "I dubbed it, just simply for reference purposes, the Gospel of Jesus' wife," end quote. We'll stop there. This fragment of ancient paper would make the network TV news and the front pages of the Boston Globe and the New York Times. It would inspire op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and Los Angeles Times, and bits by Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert on Comedy Central. Public reaction to it covered the waterfront. From conservatives, the devout, and the Holy See, there was dismissal, disbelief, and dismay. Among progressive Christians, there was excitement about the prospects of a more tolerant and egalitarian faith. Atheists saw it as one more piece of evidence that nothing in the Bible was believable. The hashtag Jesus' wife lit up Twitter, and for some time, the world of biblical scholarship had no idea what hit it. There was good reason for all this uproar. Never before had an ancient text depicted a Mary Jesus. Tradition has long portrayed the central figure of Christianity as a celibate, a lifelong bachelor whose only spouse, if one could call it that, was the church. But that wasn't the only reason for the drama. Its leading players were in many ways the very embodiments of reason and faith. On one side, you had Harvard, the richest and most powerful university in the world, a beacon of the Enlightenment and of prestigious impartial scholarship. On the other, the Roman Catholic Church, the richest and most powerful religious institution in the world, a place of spiritual mystery and cloistered intrigue. And there, on that fall day in 2012, when Dr. King made her announcement, they were quite literally staring each other down across a narrow cobblestone street, Via Paolo VI, named after a pope who vociferously defended the priestly right of celibacy and the exclusion of women from the priesthood. Now, my own interest in the story was something else beside. I had returned to it after that first explosion of publicity because I'd been there from almost the very start. Smithsonian Magazine had gotten advance word of Dr. King's discovery, and in August 2012, the editors asked if I could drop everything and fly to Harvard. The magazine wanted me to interview King and then travel to Rome to be in the room when she made her announcement to the world's top experts in the language and culture of Egypt's earliest Christians. That meant I had gotten access to the protagonists earlier than any other journalist. I was part of the machinery that helped introduce the papyrus to the world. In fact, I was the only journalist in the room beside the Vatican when Dr. King revealed her discovery to fellow scholars. And I think that's part of what fired this obsession with getting to the bottom of it. This need to know, this compulsion that I think any serious journalist has to have, which is not just to report the news, but to run it to ground, to figure out if a story, particularly a sensational one told by a powerful institution, could withstand scrutiny. In an era when the very idea of facts is under attack, I think that part of the journalistic calling is particularly important. But I had no idea what I was getting into when I decided to take this on. I had no sense of how twisted and upside down everything would become. Now, before I get too much farther, and because not everyone will remember the news coverage back in 2012, I should probably set the stage a little better. Papyrus is an ancient predecessor to paper. It's where paper got its name. It's made from the pressed and sun-dried stalks of reeds that once flourished along the banks of the Nile. Newer than clay tablets, but older than parchment, papyrus was the predominant writing surface in the Mediterranean world at the dawn of Christianity. And this particular piece of papyrus is very small. It's about the size and shape of a business card. On its front side are 8 lines of handwritten text in Coptic, the language of Egypt's earliest Christians. Coptic copies of the Gospels are among the oldest surviving copies in any language, and for a simple reason. Egypt is very dry. It's a land of vast deserts, and its arid climate preserved ancient texts that rainier parts of the world turned to mush. So really, it's sort of an accident of climate that the oldest copies of the Gospels happen to be preserved in Coptic. And Dr. King decided to call this fragment the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. And that title, just to be clear to everybody, is printed nowhere on the papyrus itself. It's a title of King's invention. And importantly, the rectangular fragment is missing all of its margins. So it appears as if it had broken off or maybe been cut from the middle of some larger sheet of papyrus. Now, this larger sheet, in turn, would have presumably been a page in some still larger codex or book. Not only is this presumably larger codex missing, each of the surviving 8 lines of text is missing its beginning and end. So, I mean, imagine if, say, 2,000 years from now, every copy of Huckleberry Finn or Pride and Prejudice had vanished, except for a small scrap of sentence fragments resected from the middle of a random page. So that's sort of how much we have of this presumably larger papyrus sheet or book. And yet the odd thing about the papyrus was that for Dr. King, the randomly surviving sentence fragments formed a coherent story with beginning, middle, and end. In her interpretation, the 8 truncated lines were evidence of a previously unknown gospel. She knew that in the 2nd century AD, believers had hotly debated the role of marriage and sexuality in a properly Christian life. The Gospel of Jesus' Wife, she proposed, must have been a previously undocumented side in that debate. Here, it seemed, was a group of 2nd century Christians who not only approved of marriage, sex, and women's discipleship for themselves, but rooted their theology in the idea of a married Jesus. And Dr. King was renowned for just this sort of work. She had risen to the top of her field by wresting meaning from Christianity's most cryptic and fragmentary text. She was really drawn to texts that were sort of puzzles. I mean, the stuff that was already sort of, fully fleshed out and every single word was there, that didn't interest her as much as the puzzles where you had parts of a surviving text and it was left to the scholar to kind of connect the dots. That's where she really brought her brilliance to bear. And this papyrus, in her view, depicted a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples over the qualifications of Mary Magdalene to be his disciple. The show-stopping line sits in the very center of the fragment and would make headlines the world over. It says simply this: Jesus said to them, "My wife." That's it. Jesus said to them, "My wife." The words that come directly before and directly after that sentence fragment are wholly unknown. But in her lecture at Rome, in her scholarly paper, and in news releases and YouTube videos circulated by Harvard, King presented the world a portrait of Jesus never before found in the ancient world. A man married to Mary Magdalene, a proud husband defending his wife against skeptics questioning her worthiness as a disciple. A savior teaching the disciples that marriage on earth is a symbol of believers' reunion in the afterlife with their divine twins in a higher realm. King suspected that this gospel of Jesus' wife must have been somehow suppressed in antiquity, perhaps because its message about Jesus' humanity and sexuality and about Mary Magdalene's leadership was at odds with the politics of the church fathers as they courted support from the patriarchs of Rome. This gospel was perhaps simply too hot to handle at a time when Christianity cast a dim eye on the physical body and its earthly needs. Now, King reminded people that the New Testament Gospels tell us nothing of Jesus' marital status. I mean, this is a surprise to a lot of people who are familiar with this picture of a celibate Jesus, but the truth is that the New Testament Gospels tell us nothing of Jesus' marital status. It's weird. They don't say that Jesus was married, but nor do they say that he's a bachelor. So there's this huge silence, this gap in which centuries of theologians, writers, and artists and filmmakers have sought to place their own interpretations. To judge from the surviving evidence, it's only in the 2nd century AD that believers begin to portray Jesus as celibate. And they may have been, and this may have been nothing more than really a matter of marketing. Now remember that Jesus was a Jew. He launched his mission in the Galilee, and Jews were his original audience. Jews were pro-marriage, and in many respects, to use a modern term, they were sex positive. The God of the Hebrew Bible blesses couplehood. God commands his people to be fruitful and multiply. And the Torah reminds man of the mitzvah of onah, a sacred duty to sexually satisfy their wives. As rabbis later wrote in the Talmud, quote, "Any man who has no wife lives without joy, without blessing, and without goodness." Yet the Jews refused to accept Jesus as their Messiah. And by the 2nd century, Jesus' followers had begun to seek converts among groups with very different views about the body. His followers' new audience were Greco-Roman pagans, many of whom exalted a life of self-denial and saw the flesh and its desires as corrupting. Some scholars argue that this 2nd century alchemy of Greek and Christian thought produced the figure of a wifeless Jesus. As one expert put it, quote, "Since Christianity was competing with other salvation cults, the degree of sexual repression in a particular area was somewhat determined by the practice of its leading local rival. Christians sometimes tried to gain status by outdoing pagans at asceticism. I think an interesting idea. So to stamp Jesus as celibate, that is, was to make him more attractive to the Greeks in some sense. But might that have been a disservice to history? I mean, the debate over whether the historical Jesus was married is also, to no small degree, a debate over Jesus's historical Jewishness. You know, did he marry, like no doubt every other Jewish rabbi of his day, or was he a renegade bachelor? It wouldn't have been a complete first. The priestly class of the Essenes, the Jewish sect thought to have written the Dead Sea Scrolls, were also said to be celibate. For King, though, the papyrus mattered for reasons that had little to do with Judaism. For her, it wasn't even really that Jesus was married. What really compelled her was the seeming identity of Jesus' wife. King had devoted her career to recovering the lost voices of women in early Christianity, and none was more central to her scholarship than Mary Magdalene. In fact, her breakthrough book was about the so-called Gospel of Mary, which is the only gospel written in the name of a woman, and it's an authentic gospel. And so, you know, the New Testament Gospels depict Mary Magdalene as one of Jesus's closest followers, an independently wealthy woman from the Galilee who follows him to Jerusalem, watches the crucifixion, and sets out to anoint his body with spices, and then discovers, of course, the empty tomb. Yet for centuries, the Roman Catholic Church, and really much of Western culture, had falsely portrayed Magdalene as a repentant prostitute. King, and you'd be surprised at how many Christians continue sort of to equate Mary Magdalene with this image of being this harlot, this sort of former sinner who was saved by Jesus. And King had long lamented this deceitful but stubbornly persistent portrayal. As she and other scholars have argued, it was a slander concocted by popes beginning in the 6th century to silence a powerful female voice in the early church. The words on this newfound papyrus, however fragmentary and incomplete, came as a kind of validation for the theories King had spent much of her life writing and talking about. They did nothing less than redeem Mary Magdalene twice over. Not only was she as fit as the male disciples to preach the good news, she was Jesus' wife, as beloved as she was human. There were enough words on this tiny fragment to create real problems for the church. Priests, of course, they take a vow of chastity and make a promise of celibacy, as it's called, in imitation of a supposedly wifeless Jesus. The church says it doesn't ordain women priests because Jesus chose no women for his very innermost circles. These 8 partial lines of Coptic packed enough firepower to rattle, if not topple, these twin pillars of Catholic tradition. It was, perhaps a little surprised that Harvard treated the papyrus like a cross between a deadly explosive and a priceless jewel. When I traveled to Harvard to see the fragment a few years ago, I discovered that none of the 400 million manuscripts in its collections enjoyed greater security. By arrangement with the papyrus's then anonymous owner, Harvard stored the fragment in Houghton Library, the most fortified and closely guarded of its 70 library buildings. Houghton houses the university's rarest books and manuscripts: the handwritten poems of Emily Dickinson, a Gutenberg Bible, illuminated medieval texts, ancient fragments of Plato, Thucydides, and Homer. Admission is highly restricted. Surveillance cameras stalk every inch of the reading room. Librarians use electronic wands to clock each time a manuscript changes hands. Nothing leaves the building. But only one manuscript in all of Houghton Library requires a full-time human minder, a librarian who literally babysits it, a kind of guard who sits at the elbow of any researcher lucky enough to be cleared to examine it. And that one manuscript was the Gospel of Jesus' wife. Even at the beginning, there was kind of an unnerving sense among scholars of every rank that something about the papyrus was off. Most of them could accept the possibility that some previously unknown group of Christians had believed in a Mary Jesus. That wasn't it. It was other things. It was the provocative title, the Gospel of Jesus' wife, that King gave the fragment. It was that in what was supposed to be a random fragment of incomplete lines, the phrase, "Jesus said to them, my wife," appeared dead center, as if on a billboard. It was the decision to unveil it beside the seat of the Roman Catholic Church. It was the almost made-for-TV tableau of Harvard versus the Vatican, of reason with a capital R dropping a bomb at the doorstep of faith. Now, I'm not sure how many people on this Zoom call have read The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown or seen the 2006 movie with Tom Hanks, but because the Da Vinci Code sold something like 80 million copies, I've no doubt most people have at least heard of it. In a nutshell, a Harvard professor of religion discovers a Catholic conspiracy to bury evidence of Jesus' marriage to Mary Magdalene, a secret whose exposure would supposedly bring the church to its knees. The thriller's fictional Harvard professor finds an important clue to this long suppressed secret by way of a cryptic message inscribed on a piece of papyrus. And so the question presented itself: was Karen King's papyrus an authentically ancient manuscript? Was it just a freak case of life imitating art, or was something darker at play? These were some of the questions I was left with after filing that first deadline story for Smithsonian Magazine in 2012. I didn't then have the time to pursue it further. I'm a freelance journalist and I had to move on. I took on different assignments from other magazines on different subjects. But those questions didn't go away. And in 2015, 3 years after my Smithsonian piece, I Googled around to see what had become of the Gospel of Jesus' wife. Scientific tests that King had commissioned seemed to have found no signs of modern forgery. Among her backers was an illustrious NYU professor, considered one of the world's leading experts on papyrus, and a New Testament scholar at Princeton. But many of King's colleagues, liberal, conservative, and everywhere in between, believed that something was amiss. Not so much the Da Vinci-esque content, but the bizarre handwriting, the grammatical errors, even the way the words were strung together. The partial lines of text in the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, a scholar discovered, could be cleverly constructed by cutting phrases from an actual gospel, the Gospel of Thomas, and reassembling them to say something new. Think of I think a good parallel, you've probably seen it in sort of Hollywood B movies, or maybe in real life, is the sort of kidnapper who fashions a ransom note from words snipped from a bunch of different magazines. You could actually sort of reverse engineer the Gospel of Jesus' Wife by taking snippets of text from the Gospel of Thomas. And it wasn't that hard to do. After 3 years, scholarly opinion had moved decidedly toward the idea that the fragment was a fake. But still, there was uncertainty. On academic blogs, debates raged over whether King had made a historic find or whether she had somehow wound up at the center of an audacious hoax. After spending some time catching up on the latest peer-reviewed journal articles, I noticed that a baffling question had yet to be answered. Where in the world did this papyrus come from? What was its ownership history, its provenance? Karen King had told reporters in 2012 that a private collector had given it to her, but she had refused to identify him. She said that he wanted anonymity and that she would respect his wishes. Where he lived, what he did for a living, King wouldn't say. The farthest I'd gotten when I pressed while writing my piece for Smithsonian was that he was a complete stranger, a cipher who emailed her out of the blue one day to say he had an interesting manuscript he'd like her to translate. His request for anonymity wasn't wholly unreasonable. I mean, many private collectors disfavor the public eye. They don't want publicity. They want a lot of questions. They may not want dealers to bother them. They have their reasons for wanting to stay out of the public eye. But as a journalist, I knew that sources mattered. When a stranger shows up in a newsroom with a sensational scoop, it's not enough just to vet the information. A diligent reporter will also investigate the source. Who are they? What's their history? How might they benefit from a particular piece of information becoming public? What ulterior motives might they have for requesting anonymity? Do they have a record of being untrustworthy? Is there anyone who can vouch for their bona fides? Now, that's not to say that you can't go ahead and publish once you've determined that information. Even, a lot of sources have access to grind. That's okay. But as a journalist, certainly, one wants to know what those access are before publishing. And I think that was something that just sort of intrigued me as I was reporting this the first time around. The final source for this discovery, of course, was Dr. King, and she was an esteemed historian at Harvard, her reputation seemingly beyond reproach. But what about her source? Isn't a chain only as strong as its weakest link? In the fall of 2015, in a dry spell between assignments, I decided to search for this anonymous collector to figure out who he was. If the truth about the Gospel of Jesus' Wife were ever to see daylight, I felt, the path to it lay in the shadows of this faceless man. But how to get to him? Despite appeals from journalists and her own colleagues, Dr. King would say nothing. This man, this private collector, had been so helpful to her. He'd agreed to everything she'd asked that she felt duty-bound to respect his only real request, which is, don't tell people who I am. So there was this huge roadblock, kind of bristling with barbed wire. I mean, King not only wouldn't say who this man was, but actually sort of, when journalists and scholars sort of agreed, hoped to do their own independent research, she sort of stood in their way. She prevented their access to information that would have allowed them to carry out their own research. And unlike some journalists setting out on an investigation, I had no court files or police records to work from. I had no sworn witness statements, no deep throat source who could hand me the whole story on a platter. I would have to kind of fit together these a puzzle whose thousands of pieces often felt deliberately scattered and hidden. This wasn't a lot of stories begin with a court case where you have unbelievable amounts of information to work from. It's all sort of there in the public record. That wasn't there. To be able to make any kind of headway, I need to hit the road. I need to do the kinds of old-fashioned shoe leather reporting that journalists still do, believe it or not, in the internet age. You have to leave the office, you have to knock on doors and make cold calls. And the only thing really I had going for me at first was a wonderful editor at the Atlantic magazine who believed that no matter how it ended, I'd have a wild detective story. I mean, I think her feeling was that even if I had found nothing, the hunt for answers might be a tale worth telling. Now, I had no intention of setting the bar that low. I didn't want to come back empty-handed to an editor at the Atlantic. That wouldn't have boded well for me. But I was grateful when she told me to trust my instincts and follow the clues, the breadcrumbs, wherever they led. And the fruits of that first investigation appeared in a story I wrote for the Atlantic in 2016. And now, after 2 additional years of full-time shoe leather reporting, it led to this book, which sweeps far beyond the magazine story into worlds I never knew existed. I traveled to 12 American states, into Germany, Italy, Norway, and Switzerland. I spent weeks in libraries, including the great Library of Congress right here in Washington, squinting at small type in decades-old German phone books, tracing the movements of characters whose lives spiraled through the story. I knocked on doors in small towns from Southwest Montana to Southern Germany, following leads from one house to the next. My path would eventually lead from the halls of the Vatican and Harvard to the headquarters of the East German Stasi, before winding back to rural Florida, where I discovered one of the most fascinating men I've ever written about. On paper, Walter Fritz looked like an unremarkable local, 50 years old, married, RV owner, licensed to fish and hunt. But once I started digging, and once he started talking, I found a man whose life bore a Da Vinci Code-like stamp long before Dan Brown had ever set pen to paper. I found a man both animated and seemingly scarred by the complex cross-currents of sexuality and faith. The relationship he'd formed with Karen King was as enigmatic as his own life story. How did this complete stranger ensnare one of the world's leading historians of early Christianity, a woman who'd grown up tough in Montana cow country, a skeptic who prided herself on her ability to dismantle and to skewer the church's long list of fictions? How does he convince her to stake so much of her reputation on a manuscript that I would discover even she knew was suspect? The usual story is one of con man and dupe, of deceiver and deceived, forger and fool. But the deeper I went, the more complicated the truth became, and the trickier the moral questions. If a truth is important enough, can one use a lie to advance it? Does a righteous end justify dishonest means? Veritas is a work of both investigative journalism and of narrative nonfiction. On its surface, it's a globe-straddling mystery, a true crime detective story at the crossroads of desire and faith. If I've succeeded, however, it will leave readers thinking about, and I think wrestling with, much larger questions about the slipperiness of truth, the seductions of belief, and the sometimes porous line between reason and faith. Thank you very much. I'm happy to open it up to the questions now.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take a little time, and I just want to again thank you. You did a great job, but I'd like to spend a little bit more time just to give people, and you're not going to give anything away. I read, I get the Atlantic, and I said this to Ariel that I read the Atlantic story, I reread the Atlantic story, and then I started the book, and you can't put the book down. This is a real life thriller story that is just amazing in that. Could you talk a little bit about who Karen King is, and just a little bit about her ascent, and the fact that in this, a little bit, because you go into both the psychological and historical and all the background of each of the characters. And I think it's just be interesting to hear a little bit about her more, and how even as a professor, how she got interested in the aspect. And also if you'd make the distinction a little bit about the Nag Hammadi pieces that she got interested in, and how that affected her
Sure.
a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Karen King grew up in a ranching town in southwest Montana called Sheridan, which I visited in the course of reporting the book. I don't even think it has a single stoplight. Fairly conservative place. And she was like this kind of incredibly bright kind of loner. It was a small town where, like, if you weren't part of the group, it was almost like you didn't exist. And Karen King never felt part of that group as a kid. And then the one sort of blessing in a very homogenous town, 700 people, was that there were 5 churches you could go to. So if you, most of the town, sort of the preeminent church was the Methodist Church. But Karen King decided when she was a teenager that she wanted something a little more serious, and she abandoned the church that her family was part of, and most of the towns were, walked across the street to the Episcopal Church, which had a mostly older membership. She was the only youth in its Bible study, but for her it felt more serious. It felt more intellectually serious than the Methodist Church she'd grown up with, and craving a kind of a sense of belonging. She sort of fled the Methodist Church to the Episcopal Church. She also had this other very formative experience that she'd never talked about, that I had discovered when I talked to some of her childhood friends, which was she went to a Methodist summer camp in which she made a kind of evangelical conversion and accepted Jesus as her personal savior. And it was this really transformative, empowering experience for her. And when she came back to Sheridan, a teacher at her Sunday school sort of poo-pooed the experience, saying, yeah, what happened to you out there, it's not as big of a deal as you think. It'll pass. This isn't really how we do Christianity as Methodists. This is not really, don't put too much stock into it. And I think this idea that even in a small town, there were sort of people in authority who policed the line between kind of right-thinking and wrong-thinking Christians. It sort of planted a seed with her. Like, who gets to tell people whether they're doing their faith the right way? And that's something that crosses all religions. And I think that just compounded the sense of outsiderness that Karen King had always felt. And so she went to the University of Montana, I think originally thinking that she would be pre-med. But then she walks into a class taught by a professor named John Turner called simply Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is a sort of catch-all, somewhat controversial term for a series of early Christian texts that did not make the New Testament. They represent a view of Jesus and his teachings that are different from the one, slightly different, in some ways similar, but in other ways importantly different from the teachings of Jesus that you find in the accepted sort of the canonical text, the New Testament. And for King, this was fascinating because it showed that early Christianity, contrary to sort of dogma, wasn't this united, harmonious era in which all Christians agreed on what Jesus said and thought. There was, in fact, a huge debate. There was cacophony. There was one group that said this about Jesus, another group that said this other thing. And so this really spoke to her in the sense that Christians were never united. We always were, debating what counted as the true faith. And the idea that there was this powerful kind of mysterious, somewhat, very intellectual, cerebral group of sort of dropouts. I mean, I'm romanticizing them a little bit, but the Gnostics were sort of cerebral dropouts on the margins who didn't really engage with society too much, but wanted to sort of think big thoughts about what Jesus meant and how to live a life of the mind apart from the body. And that really spoke to her. And as soon as she took that class her sophomore year, she dropped out of pre-med and declared herself a religious studies major. And then eventually goes to graduate school at Brown to study early Christianity. And then is hired right out of Brown, a tenure track position at Occidental College in Los Angeles. where she becomes a star teacher. I mean, students are just mesmerized by Karen King. She's a very, I mean, she will tell you she's an introvert. She's by nature sort of shy, but in her classroom, she's just this sort of enormous mind. And she is really, really great at taking students who are very comfortable in their belief of what Christianity was and making them uncomfortable and raising all kinds of questions that they never thought to ask. And she very quickly won a number of teaching awards there. And then after doing a fellowship at Harvard in the mid-1990s, a fellowship that brought in scholars who studied women in religion, she was recruited by Harvard to become a professor at the Divinity School. And it was a very competitive job search, as one might imagine. And there was her hiring was controversial in some ways because she had not yet published a single book, even though she had been out of graduate school for something like 12 years. But she had backers there who thought that she would be an important addition to the staff. And she became a professor there, teaching classes on heresy, of course, which is the category in which texts that didn't make the New Testament are called heretical. She tried to sort of dismantle that idea that they should be called heretical. She also taught classes on sexuality in early Christianity. But she really didn't have a breakthrough. She didn't really have a public breakthrough until the publication of all things of the Da Vinci Code, because the Da Vinci Code tells a story of a lot of these texts that she studied that didn't make the New Testament, like the Gospel of Mary, like the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Thomas, all of which portray Mary Magdalene in this more prominent role. And so Karen King became kind of the go-to expert for a lot of reporters interested in the questions raised by the Da Vinci Code. And it's this really weird thing because a lot of scholars of religion were really uncomfortable about the Da Vinci Code. Sure, they were happy that people were interested in asking questions about faith, but the Da Vinci Code is not history. The Da Vinci Code is very explicitly a work of fiction. And Karen King was sort of notable in that she was more comfortable. She wasn't necessarily discomfited by the fact that the Da Vinci Code was a work of fiction. She viewed it, as she told me when I interviewed her in 2012, as this huge teaching moment, an opportunity to get the public interested in these authentic texts that were central to her scholarship. So really the Da Vinci Code is sort of what begins to give Karen King a public profile.
So it's a fascinating thing, but one of the things that you build in, and what is, I think, a beautiful job in this is that you not only talk about the authenticity of and the scrutiny of the text and all the manners in which we're going to test a text, its size, its margin, its everything, to talk about its authenticity of truth. And you do the exact same thing as a journalist with each of the characters or players in this. You take them from their origins, take them through, you look at their consistency or inconsistency, and I think it's the parallel between what's done to the text itself and what's done to them, and how each of them uses a text, a particular text, to promote what they want to promote for their own purposes is beautifully laid out. One of the things that I found really interesting, and maybe you can talk a little bit about this, because I was reminded of this Stan Lusby, who taught at Leslie's alumni, one of her alumni places, the University of Chicago, which had been for so long one of the beacons of the understanding of academic search for truth and religion. Stan Lusby talked, and he did the images of Jesus. And in the time that Karen was going through this in the early 70s and the explosions, the images of Jesus was a portrait of saying that going through and showing in storefront churches in Chicago and other places, that the images of Jesus were portrayed. If it was a Black church, Jesus was Black. If it was an Asian church, then Jesus would appear in the minds. And what Karen took on in so many ways was, and the struggle was, and when she went to Occidental, she was always looking to find herself and her place in Christianity. And you show that through Turner and others, and through this style of Christianity or the outlying text of that, she was able to talk about that. Will you talk just a little bit, because she was also a risk taker? I mean,
yeah, I mean, absolutely. She was, and she really was trying. The interesting thing about Karen King is that, and I get more into this in more detail in the book, is that at Harvard Divinity School is unusual among the divinity schools in the United States, in that it is both a place that trains ministers. It's not denominational, but it both trains people to work in ministry, but it also houses the greater number of religion scholars at Harvard. Unlike almost all of its elite peers, Harvard does not have a freestanding secular department of religious studies, and that's been a longstanding debate whether it should or not. And so the people, and King in some ways it really fits into that mold, in that on the one hand she's doing history, on the other hand she's producing what she will, if you read her footnotes of her books closely enough, what she hopes will produce. She's also producing theology. And so that's a tricky place to occupy, because history and theology aren't necessarily the same thing and shouldn't be pursued in the same way. And so part of what she's doing is trying to create tools Christians can use to critique their own faith and remake their own faith in their own image. And so that's something that, as a Reform Jew, myself, and I think Washington Hebrew congregation as well, we do that all the time with, remaking the prayers to make them more gender inclusive, for instance. And that doesn't necessarily, we don't do that because we can footnote that in history. We don't need to go back to some historical text to say, well, it's not there, that they weren't there, or they were there, and therefore we should do it for that reason. But we can do it because it's a good thing to do now, because society has changed, and we now have moral imperatives that maybe people were too thick-headed in the past to understand about the importance of inclusion. But what King was doing was sort of this interesting two-step, where on the one hand, she's saying, I'm giving you tools to remake your faith, and those things don't necessarily need to be true for us to do those, or not. On the other hand, I'm a historian using just the facts, and I think that there winds up being a conflict between her roles as a historian, her role as a theologian, that really come to sort of a tragic intersection in this story, where the standards a theologian uses to establish something as good gets confused with the standards a historian uses to establish whether something is true, and that's sort of the larger intellectual.
Now you spent some time beautifully talking about that when you talk about her lectures at Occidental, if I remember, about her talking about and how about doctrine and fact, the apple and the sin, and how she as an underthing, because when she came to Occidental, and what an underlying theme of this is that she was not only this class religious scholar, but she also embraced women's studies, and she served both purposes at Occidental and was known. And there was a bleed between them, because when you talk about her finding her place, or singing, this is what they think about, in the image of Jesus, she was out to make out the image of Christianity into her narrative story. And I think that, could you talk a little bit about that? Because you do a beautiful job, and I'm sure, having done your own father's story and others, how we take on the and especially as Jews, narrative becomes so incredibly important, and that played a key part in both in her scholarly work, in how she saw this text, and also it apparently played a real strong part in her theological disposition as well.
Yeah, I think I think Karen King really saw herself in the figure of Mary Magdalene, in the sense that here was a woman who clearly was one of Jesus' most important followers, who was the first to see the risen Jesus, who was an independent woman, apparently according to the Gospels, funding Jesus' work out of her own wealth, and yet was maligned by the Catholic Church, and was made out to be this repentant prostitute, because Pope Gregory in the 6th century combined these different narratives of different women in the Gospels into this composite marriage that winds up being mistaken and maligned simply because she was close to Jesus, and perhaps because, according to some scholars, there was a group of early Christians who really valued Mary Magdalene's voice, and that's all true. And I think she really found herself in the figure of Mary Magdalene, and found a way to express her own spiritual and intellectual disposition through Mary Magdalene, which I think is a wonderful thing that faith can do. And the question, I guess, that one wrestles with is this question of methodology. Is in what is the meaning of truth in the context of religion? And for journalists and for scientists, we still there is a sense that there is an objective truth out there to some extent. We may not always achieve it. We may not always be able to capture it perfectly, but by with evidence, with interviews, with research, we can get closer to a verifiable reality that's out there in the world. And I think for people of faith, certainly when they're in their house of worship, or when they're in a moment of private meditation or prayer or reflection, you don't need history for that. That's one of the things for me, that makes spirituality interesting, is that it can be this flight of fancy. It doesn't need to be footnoted. I mean, it's the very fact that it doesn't need to be footnoted that can make it so liberating. It allows us to explore these worlds of spiritual possibility that don't exist in the real world, and that's what makes religion so transporting sometimes. And then I think you have this third category that I think Karen King and some of her colleagues are in, which is kind of this postmodern space, where there is no such thing as truth. We all have our own truths. We all speak our own truths. And there, it's sort of alternative facts, where I have my facts and you have yours, and it's okay if they don't meet. And I think it's complicated when a historian starts to use postmodern methodology to decide whether a piece of history exists or not. So for like a lot of what postmodernism does is probably worthy, in the sense of, when I read a religious text, and when you read a religious text, and when someone 300 years ago read a religious text, they probably take away different meanings from it based on where they're located, what their values are. And that's okay. That's a wonderful insight into how readers read and interpret text. And there are a multiplicity of possible interpretations. However, when one is doing history, either the Gospel of Jesus' wife existed as an authentic document, manuscript in the past, or it didn't. They're not multiple interpretations. And I think what happened with the Gospel of Jesus' wife, without giving away too much, is that there was a bleeding of kind of postmodern theory into the work of history, which didn't serve Harvard Divinity School particularly well in this instance. And the debate over what Harvard Divinity School represents and how it should do its work is one that has been at the forefront of the school for a long time, and it's had many critics. And it's still an very much open debate there.
So, I just want to put this in a little context, because it's not that what this play in is all the time in the very scholarship that is at stake of taking a text, an ostracon, a text out of context, and trying to understand what the missing pieces are, whatever. Whether we have something which your father would call a hapax legomenon, something that only appears once, and never appears. And so how do we do that? And we all know that within Hebrew itself, we have just consonants, okay? So we have HT, and did Ariel mean hit, hot, hat, hut, and so we look for how that is in context to understand that. So in the part of translation itself, when we go, translation necessitates interpretation. We all know that even as famous scholars like Rashi parse, because there's no periods, there's no anything in the text. The text is, it's line after line, it's contiguous, because it was an oral tradition taken down into a written form, and grammar doesn't get imposed on it, at least for Hebrew, until much later. And in some sense, it doesn't get imposed to some of these texts until until centuries later, leaves so much up to interpretation. And the mixing of interpretation of linguistic styles to support doctrine is not something that Karen King invented. It was actually the palace that she was working in. She was only trying to use it to her advantage. So it's not that she started this nefarious activity, but it just didn't work out in the way of this particular thing. Talk a little bit about what happened with our own Herschel Shanks here and some of the things that, where other hoaxes had gone on.
Yeah, I mean, this is by no means the first. Again, I want people to read the book to discover what happened in this particular case. But the idea that the history of hoaxes involving religion goes back, centuries. Whether it's the donation of Constantine, in the Middle Ages, all the way to the James Ossuary, which was a bone box that Herschel Shanks, Biblical Archaeological Review, presented, I think back in 2002, in which there was this ossuary in which that refers to James, the brother of Jesus, and it was presented on the cover of the Biblical Archaeological Review as the first archaeological evidence that Jesus existed. And a panel of scholars would later conclude that it was a fake. It remains controversial. And you have examples of this, across history, because there's a lot at stake. People, I mean, look, in certain kinds of forgery, the motive is financial. Oftentimes, when you're talking about paintings by the masters, or works of art, the motive of a forger is financial. They want to paint something that by a great artist that will fetch a huge price at auction. And with religious forgeries, the motives can often be different. They can be a desire to rewrite history, desire to seek revenge on a faith that that the forger has felt abused by or misserved by. It can often be a more private, personal thing. I mean, there's this book will talk about a case of a boy who was abused by a Catholic church. It ties into the story, and so I think that with the case of religious forgeries, sometimes the motives are not simply pecuniary. That there are reasons people want to speak in the voice of God. I mean, remember, when you're forging a religious text, you're essentially, for the devout, you are attempting to speak in the voice of God, and that's a pretty audacious thing to do. And so yes, of course, people will pour themselves into these lacunae, these gaps in the text, in ways that can be self-serving. In fact, I talk about, there's a great papyrologist named Herbert Uti from Michigan, who talked about the work of papyrologists. How papyrologists are always dealing with texts in which there are going to be gaps. There's going to be a place where an insect, nibbled a hole right in the middle of a word that you really need to understand. And so he had this rule called Lex Uti, or Uti's law, which said, "Thou shalt not edit too much around a hole," because holes represent great temptations, because you want to fill the hole in a way that serves your own theories. All of us would want to do that. It's our natural inclination. So he's saying, be very, very careful when you encounter a gap in the text to make sure that you're not putting in there exactly what you've always wanted to discover to be true.
Well, we know this in terms of our own tradition, but the masters also do what religious texts do, in a sense. It's called pentimento. We repaint the scene, we paint over, and it's very clear that within the context of religious doctrine, that there are times that we repaint something, the sense. And one of the big chasms that drives this, in a sense, and the irony of sort of this, of what you deal with in terms of the personal lives of the individuals, the church takes a stand on both the role of women, and that and has rewrites Genesis in Augustine and in way, rewrites Genesis, or rewrites Genesis in a sense that original sin, that sex is bad, and that certain things, and this still affects us today in ways we don't even think about. The fact that I'm wearing a necktie is because people thought that the buttonholes that you have on your shirt were too sensuous to see. We have dust covers on we have furniture where there's little flaps over the legs, because the Puritans believed that we would have lustful thoughts if we saw these things. So just if you would talk a little bit about the contrast, because I got a little upset because in there she throws Judaism under the bus in terms of, the way we, as you put it, sex positive, I think you said, or sexual positive. Talk a little bit about that contrast, but that process of pentimento, we have changed our things. We have a women's commentary now for the Bible, where we look at it through the same prism, and you draw this thing that all of a sudden King goes from what you call I think you said the Mayberry, and I can't remember, it was two classical things that she goes from the prism of Mayberry to the prism of sort of the intellectual to see religion, and changes. How does the view of sex and sexuality play into this whole story in this? And it's the irony is that, there's I won't give it away, but it's fascinating. One of the characters in here who ends up running both a pornography studio and a papyrus studio, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that misogyny in the Bible, in the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, it runs deep. I mean, women were marginalized, and these are texts largely written by men from a male perspective that no doubt suppress the voices of women. And so I want to also be really clear, there's a lot of wonderful scholarship, a lot of wonderful feminist scholarship, and a lot of great evidence for the sort of the ways in which women have been marginalized by these religious texts. The Gospel of Jesus' Wife just isn't an example of that great scholarship and that great evidence. So I want to make clear to people, there is a lot of truth to the larger story that King has sought to tell. And the question is when our ardor for that story comes at the expense of the evidence that we choose to use in service of that story. And that's where it becomes complicated. And clearly, I mean, as a Reformed Jew myself, I think there's a great deal of importance in making sure that our houses of worship are inclusive and that everyone feels welcome. But I don't need to find evidence. I mean, personally, I don't have a dog in the fight in the Christian fight, but I, as a human being, I don't know that I need to be able to footnote that in some ancient document for it to be worthy of inclusion in our services today. I write about that a little bit in my first book. What does it mean to raise a Jewish child? I mean, I'm Jewish, my wife isn't. We raised our children Jewish. I certainly can't check all the boxes that the ancient rabbis would have us check to have my children regard themselves as Jewish, but they do, and that's okay. And for reasons that have nothing to do with what might have the standards of the past. And so the question again is sort of what does it matter? Do we need to dismantle history in order to espouse certain values in our houses of worship today? Or is it okay for history to be at odds with that? I mean, can we just say that, early Christianity and probably early Judaism was a pretty patriarchal, probably terribly patriarchal place, and have that be the past, but how the future be different. And again, this is not something I have a lot of expert. This is just my very personal. I'm not a rabbi. I don't have your scholarly wisdom, but just as a journalist.
I've been doing a hoax for the last 36 years on the congregation. So, so one of the things interesting that I found is you use the term at one point of, I think it's shape shifting. I'm not good at shape shifting. Where we change ourselves, and you talk about one of the characters in this who becomes the little darling and plays up to this. You also bring out the fact that King shifts and changes certain things to protect her integrity. But also you point out that both of these characters at times, King often says in the beginning, it doesn't matter the veracity of this text. It's the question that this text raises. Yeah. And so in some ways, it's just that it backfired on it. I thought that that was a fascinating point that you brought up about in both of these characters. And I'd like you to, as a journalist, the last 4 years, journalism has been maligned. And really, this is a true opportunity because you present us the facts, you present us these things, and you don't really draw conclusions, but you present them and say it may lead you to think X, Y, and Z, but it's brilliantly done. And I really want to commend you because you go down every foxhole available. You also explore the theological. You talk about the tension. This is both a thriller and a very educational book. And I just want to commend you. I can't imagine, but would you talk a little bit about that shape-shifting, and do you believe today that journalism is doing that? Or do you believe that it still holds the mark of the type of integrity? And I'm sure.
I think clearly journalism matters. I say that just because it's my profession. I wouldn't do it if I didn't believe in it. But I do think that journalism plays an important role in sort of establishing a common set of facts that are necessary in a community and a democracy. Because if we no longer agree on anything and all of us have our own truths, then we can't have a conversation. We can't have conversations anymore, and we can't debate anything because we don't even agree on what the facts are. And so that role of journalists of sort of going out and knocking on doors, making phone calls, not just Googling everything, or crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. I think that I hope that we as a society continue to value the great work that journalists at not only well-known and prestigious institutions like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal all do, but at local papers around the country. I started out at the Providence Journal on Rhode Island, and boy, we used to have an office on every small town's main street, and our job was to hold power to account in various ways. In that context, it was usually the city council or the school board. But I think that role of establishing a kind of a common set of facts and of holding power to account, or as the old saw puts it sometimes, to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. I think that mission is really remains important. And in this case, it's sort of a non-traditional subject in the sense that I'm not reporting on a presidential administration or mismanagement of public funds, but it's still an effort to hold power to account. I mean, Harvard is an immensely powerful institution, and when it tells a story, people listen. I don't think Smithsonian Magazine would have been interested in the story if this discovery weren't coming out of Harvard. And Harvard was the stamp of approval, the stamp of legitimacy that gave it a kind of authority that I don't think it would have had otherwise. So yes, I believe in journalism, and I think that people should subscribe to newspapers and care about particularly hometown papers that are still out there covering these unglamorous school board meetings and city hall meetings, because it's the only way that you can bring accountability to power.
Well, you do. I mean, one of the things that you talk about in this book, which is so fascinating, is how everybody was using everybody else. That King used the media, King used the Harvard Journal, she used the Biblical Archaeological Review, she juxtaposed one off the other. This was certainly something that you said was decisions were made based on a market analysis in terms of this, and the president of Harvard was either used the Divinity School and its opportunity to change and bolster this. So it's fascinating because it's not only the integrity of the scholars themselves, but it's the integrity of the institutions. I just want to commend you. I also want to tell you that this is a worthy book to read on so many levels. First of all, in one book, to go from reading about being in the halls of and looking at the statue of Augustine on the grounds of the Vatican, which I've stood there and had conversations with and literally walked by it with Pope Francis. And then in the same venue of the same things, that part of that, the thing that was so threatening to it is presented by somebody who also is doing simultaneously or has been involved in the proliferation of pornography. And the irony of somebody, on the one hand, one individual who's looking to find their truth and providing things of, getting rid of a certain misogyny and whatever, is being led on by somebody who is engaged in that type of behavior and the use of other people. I want to open it up for questions before we close up, and then I'll turn to Leslie. I'm going to turn to gallery if you want to raise your hand in the little piece before bottom, or just speak up. I'm sure you've had questions if anybody had the opportunity. Go ahead. Well, that's Leslie. I'd like to give, is there anybody from besides who, I want to give the congregation a chance. Okay. All right, go ahead, Leslie.
I was just going to say, you describe, the situation where she herself was so sort of disinterested almost in learning about the provenance. And after your Atlantic piece came out, and you I think she wasn't particularly interested in even talking to you about what you had found. I found that so extraordinary. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your reaction to her disinterest in learning the provenance, her own failure to pursue the provenance, and Harvard's willingness to throw the weight of its PR office and everything behind a story that was so, unverified. I think journalistically, I can't imagine, bringing in my editor a scoop with something like this and not having someone say, well, where did you get this? I mean, what does this represent? Who gave this to you? I just find that amazing. And I have to commend you, because I think that also as a former student at the Divinity School there, I think that you've totally captured the ethos of the place. But even I was shocked by the failure to pursue the truth, being perhaps overly influenced by the theological implication of breaking new theological ground or something.
Yeah, I mean, that was interesting. I mean, I had a really great relationship with Dr. King. I thought writing the Smithsonian piece when it was just a matter of discovery. She was about to discover it. I spent many hours with her at Harvard and then in Rome. But I think once things went south, she was no longer interested in talking to journalists. And that was one of the things that surprised me when I was reporting the Atlantic piece. As I do before any story, if I've discovered new information that may implicate someone else's previous conclusions, I will always go to them. And in this case, because what I discovered was so explosive, I said, look, I'd love to sit down with you, let you know what I found, give you an opportunity to think about it, and let me know whether it changes your view at all of the authenticity of the Gospel of Jesus Christ papyrus. And she responded, I see no point in the conversation. She said, I'll happily read your piece when it comes out, but I don't need to. I haven't engaged the provenance questions at all. And I think to a lot of that quote, when it came out in the Atlantic story, was many of her historian colleagues found shocking, because for a historian to say, I'm not particularly interested, it goes against the very principles of the field, which is to understand the past and to not be interested in provenance, which is essentially just history of an object. And to say, as she did to me, that I didn't think the provenance could be investigated, was either extremely naive or it's just disingenuous. And I mean, what's that?
How did you react to her at that point?
I mean, I try to never be judgmental when I'm doing interviews. I'm very open. And I'm not going to push. I wanted to let her know that I have this material. I thought she'd find it interesting, and I really wanted to have her voice in the piece. But she wasn't interested in having the conversation. But after the story came out in 2016, the first story, this is before many of the new discoveries that are presented in the book. She did call me the next day and say, I now believe the Gospel of Jesus' life is a fake. And so that was big news. And that, in fact, was big enough news that the Boston Globe put it above the fold on the front page. And so I don't know. I think part of it is she realized at that point that there was a big enough PR problem that she needed to come around and say something publicly about what had happened. On the other hand, I do think she still operates, and I don't want to give away the ending of the book, but there's a sort of a set piece in the final chapter, in which there's a real question about what her stand is on the papyrus. Because if you are a believer that the objective truth of the papyrus's authenticity matters, if you're not a believer in that, then you could continue to use the papyrus as a stepping off point for conversations about issues that she continues to believe are important, even if the text isn't real. She said as much to the Harvard Crimson. Is like, all this debate about forgery, it takes attention away from the very important questions the papyrus asks. And the question is whether a fake papyrus can ask important questions, or whether one should actually use real evidence, of which there is plenty, to ask those questions. And it's a really interesting intellectual place that she finds herself. And I wonder whether that same intellectual place informs why she doesn't want to engage with journalists. Because if we all have our own facts, then there's no point in correcting a falsehood. It's an interesting question. I don't want to answer it too firmly. I really think readers should engage with the book on their own terms.
I want to just, and I don't think it's going to give away anything, but I think that you asked, if you turn to your copy and turn to page 327, look and see on the top of the page if you want to just share that paragraph, because it's so poignant what you do.
Let's.
Liberating faith from the group of insular elites.
Yeah.
I don't think you're going to give anything away by that paragraph, but it's a very good paragraph, and it's just.
You said 327?
327 top.
Okay.
I can give you an annotated.
So I'll just read a couple. Yeah, I mean, liberating faith from the grip of insular elites was a worthy cause, but King's approach to it looked scarcely more like history than the work of theologians at the Vatican or Moody Bible Institute, who cherry-picked other ancient texts as quote-unquote historical proof for the righteousness of their beliefs. Secular historians don't lead creed and canon councils. So now we're getting into more detail, but I think that's where I think this leads. And I think it's there are other scholars at the Harvard Divinity School who are very explicitly doing theological work. They're saying, look, I'm going to construct a theology that I believe is morally righteous and that people should use in the context of their faith. And it's normative. They're saying they're using shoulds. I think what we don't get with King is I do think that that's fundamentally what she's doing, but publicly she's self-presenting as a historian. And I think that's where the tension lies. Whereas you get like a feminist, a very esteemed feminist theologian like Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, who's very explicitly telling you, I am doing theology. I am telling you what I believe is righteous. And this is how we can put together the faith in a way that is less misogynistic, that is less corrupted by male power. And she's very explicit about that. And whereas King is self-presenting as just the facts historian, but is in fact doing theology. But I want to say too much more about that. But
I want to thank you so much. This is a fabulous book, and I highly encourage people to take a look at it. I'd be happy to do a Tuesday night if people want to do a follow-up on once they get a chance to read the book. I'm telling you, I see a movie script coming from this somewhere down the line, because the intrigue of this far exceeds anything of the Da Vinci Code, because this is not fantasy, but real life that plays out. We have the link there for people who want to do that. I want to ask Leslie real quick to give us an upcoming, and then I'll continue to thank Ariel. Just a fabulous book and a great opportunity for us to spend the afternoon and the early evening with you.
Thank you.
Leslie?
Well, again, thank you so much, Ariel. It's absolutely fascinating. And our next program will be on Sunday, February 28th at 5 p.m. Over Zoom. Maurice Samuels, a professor of French at Yale, who heads its program for the study of anti-Semitism as well as Judaic studies, will recount another suspenseful story brimming with intrigue and lush detail that is the subject of his new book, The Betrayal of the Duchess, the scandal that unmade the Bourbon monarchy and made France modern. It's about a high-spirited French duchess who fought to claim the Bourbon throne for her young son in 1832, that she was at first aided and then betrayed by the son of France's chief rabbi, had a lasting impact on the nature of French anti-Semitism. Today, with the third largest Jewish population in the world, we know that France continues to struggle with anti-Semitism, including violent attacks by radicalized Muslims, which polls show have prompted many French Jews to consider emigration. So it's another really lively, interesting historical tale to liven up our days. And
thank you. The last question I just want to ask you and doing is that, having given this in terms of it, what did you walk away with this? And nachas to your father, who I think is on here. He should be very proud of you for your accomplishments here. But what, as a Jew looking at this, is what did you walk away with this in terms of looking and contrasting to some of the things that you've experienced or see within the realities of the Jewish community that you've grown up in?
I mean, for me, it's just to repeat briefly what I said earlier. It's just the sense of, you know, when we're in a house of worship, when we're in our private spiritual moment, to what extent do we need to be able to footnote the tools we're using in history? Does it matter, and should it matter, or is faith precisely the acceptance of things unseen? And that's what makes faith so wonderful and so liberating, is that it actually disentangles us from this need to root everything in the past, that we can actually imagine a better world instead of dwelling on fixing a broken one in the past. That they didn't always get things right. We can imagine, we can spin these visions of a better world, privately or collectively. And that's just my own. This is not normative at all. It's just the way I sort of experience it. But it really made me think about those questions about, to what extent, what role does history play in when we're having a spiritual experience?
So the social context of your book and putting into frame and seeing how our leaders, but I think that your book asks some incredible questions. I think the veracity, integrity of both scholarship, the veracity, integrity of the difference between theological doctrine and spiritual quest are all brought forward and through this. And I think the takeaway is that we shouldn't challenge our preachers, our rabbis, but just accept blanketly, coldly. No, just teasing. A great opportunity, a really well done book. You're to be commended. And we look forward to your next adventure. Anything on the horizon for you in writing?
Working on some new magazine stories, but nothing to announce yet. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And Leslie, thank you again. And ladies and gentlemen, have a good Sunday evening. And I guess we'll all find out a lot in the days and weeks to come. Thank you.